Nate. Nate, if you can share your camera, please. You are, and I see you're already sharing your screen. Correct.
Brian,
So
I like
I
your
don't
hat.
see
No, I'm
your
going to
camera.
leave
I
my
do hear
camera
you.
off because my office is
Thank.
poorly lit.
That is no problem. So then I will just full focus on your screen in this matter.
Fantastic.
I would say the stage is yours. Let's
Awesome.
not waste any time because we only have basically 25 minutes of talks and 5 minutes of Q&A. Let's give it a go.
I'm on it. Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Nate Schutta. Best way to describe me is architect as a service. I go places, at least I used to before global pandemic struck. Maybe I'll go places again in the future. I work for VMware. I'm part of the advocacy group. So I'm mostly architect guy. I've spent a lot of years doing various things in software engineering, mostly at big enterprisey companies. And so I've seen this shift over my career. This used to be so easy. We had a monolith or two or three, and we released versions semi-annually. We all worked on the same floor, or at least pretty close to one another. But looking around now, that's just not the reality for us. You've probably got dozens or hundreds or thousands of services, and some of those versions are changing every day, multiple times a day. Your team isn't all co-located in one office. You've got folks all over the world. And to be clear, architect job, this role has never been easy, but now we have to deal with massively distributed applications with teams that are also themselves dispersed all around the world. And how do we handle that? The first step in any of these situations is just acknowledge reality. I mean, we're not all in the same project room anymore. And in fact, we're probably not even all on the same continent. It's been pretty clear to me that remote work is more normalized, and this is certainly before we've gotten into the coronavirus. But there's been a series of articles over the last few years talking about how remote work is becoming more common and more people are asking for this. Remote work statistics are frankly pretty mind blowing when you see how many people are actually doing it. The ThoughtWorks folks have talked quite a bit about this. And, this began during the recession of kind of 08, 09 as a way for companies to save money on office space. And many of us now have looked at it and said, hey, this is strategic. I actually view it personally as a requirement. I've been working full time from home now for 3 years. And a lot of this boils down to the desire for flexibility, the desire to have more family time, to deal with house prices that are out of control, to not want to have multiple hour-long commutes. And of course, this is all before what many of us are dealing with right now with coronavirus. And so I do think this is going to have a pretty substantial effect on this whole work from home movement as well. I know Martin has posted a couple of different pieces about how ThoughtWorks is handling this. It's been very interesting to see the kind of challenges that they've been dealing with. And I ran into this article actually today talking about how this is probably going to accelerate the future of work, what we look at as the norm now, and how that's going to change over the course of the next few months. I saw this tweet and I thought, this is going to be interesting to see how people react once we do start loosening up some of these social distancing guidelines. I know my wife has been working full time from home now for about a month, and it's going to be interesting to see how she shifts back. And, it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of offices we even go back to when this is all over. I think the pretty decent chance these open office spaces might be doomed in this new world. And so putting aside pandemics and natural disasters, let's be honest, there's a pretty good chance that most of the best talent in the world is not located within a generous distance from your headquarters. And more of us, frankly, want to work remotely. I know a good friend of mine was doing a job search about a year ago, and there were a couple companies that are like, oh yeah, great, let's get you on board. And they're like, okay, we're going to need you to relocate. And he was like, lol, no. This is where I live, this is where my family is, I'm not going to uproot them just for this job. And so he turned down two or three jobs because some of these companies just weren't interested in that. A lot of us find much increased job satisfaction out of this. I don't think that's too much of a surprise. I think many of us are more productive when we're working from home, although it is hard sometimes to keep that balance in place. It's very easy for work to bleed into life more than we would like. A lot of us are working from home more often. This again is interesting to see how statistics on this have changed, which I don't think is too much of a surprise. Now, I don't have an office in any of our buildings, at least not that I'm aware of. My entire team is distributed around the world. A huge chunk of people in the US work from home at least some of the time. And that's not to say it's all of the time. It might be one day a week, it might be periodically. And for many people, it's a bit of an adjustment. There's no getting around it. It's been interesting to see how, with my wife working in the other room and my son now doing learning from home, to see how we've all kind of adjusted to all of us being around each other all of the time. And how do we sort of have some of these separations? I know a number of people who actually have a routine to signal the start or the end of their day. Scott Hanselman tweeted this out at one point saying, "Hey, go commute, quote unquote, to your home office." And what he meant was just walk around the block, basically. And I had friends who would walk out the back door of their house, walk around to the front door of their house to signal the beginning of the day, and then walk out the front door of their house and then back into the back door as a way of ending their day. I tend to do this by what I'm wearing. Now, my wife jokes that I wear work from home pajamas. She's not wrong, but I have sort of in my head, this is sort of work attire versus this is lounge attire, if you will. Now, what's fascinating to me is even when I have been in a physical office with other people, it's a pretty good chance you are using some kind of remote communication technology anyway. When I was an architect at an enterprise financial company not too long ago, I took almost all of my meetings from my desk because it was the only way I could get to all my meetings. And so, even though there were meeting rooms somewhere, I was never in them because it was easier to do it while sitting in my desk. And I realized one day, whether I'm at home or in my office in St. Paul doesn't really change much, frankly. And of course, whether you're 9 feet or 9 floors or 9 miles away, there's a pretty good chance that you're working with people over Slack and over other types of communication technologies. There's a pretty good chance everyone on this stream has messaged someone that's next to them, across the hall from them. We don't have to be around the world in order to use these. And it's been really interesting to see how these tools have improved. I mean, maybe Slack hasn't been a huge improvement. I don't know. We could argue about that around the edges, but I can basically do my entire job from my laptop. Wherever my laptop is, that's where my office is. We've all got soft phones or cell phones, and there's an awful lot that we can accomplish without needing some of the tools that we used to have back in the old days. Video conferencing helps. I was on one remote project many years ago where we had one group of people in St. Paul, one group of people in Hartford, and it wasn't working real well until we installed video conferencing in both rooms. And it was a little weird at first because the expectation was that the video conferencing would be on the entire time. And so it was a little strange. You'd walk in the morning, first person would turn the video conferencing system on, and then the last person out would shut it down. And so there's always a little bit of, oh, this is kind of strange. But we gradually adjusted to the fact that when we'd start to communicate with somebody over email or over messaging, you'd be like, hey, let's just go to the window. That's what a lot of us refer to it as. And you'd walk over and you'd have essentially a face-to-face conversation, and it greatly simplified things in many ways. Now, of course, keep in mind that conference lines often have just enough of a lag to be annoying. It's very easy to talk over people. You need to be very respectful of your remote staff and be very, very aware of time zones. The hardest part about remote teams is tribal knowledge kind of goes out the window. Although, to be blunt, tribal knowledge isn't really great to begin with. So there's going to be a little more ceremony than we might have in a traditional project room. It can't just be the whiteboard. But I want to stress you shouldn't be overly prescriptive in how you approach these things. Different teams will work in different ways, and that's perfectly fine. You just need to do what's right. You need to experiment. You need to adapt, and you need to be patient. We've seen a lot of that, frankly, as people have adjusted to this. You should also be willing to learn from people who've done this before. The Basecamp folks have been doing this for a long time. They've got various information on their website about this. We've been doing this for quite a long time as well. We've done quite a bit of remote pairing over the years. So, it can be done. Don't feel like this is impossible by any stretch of the imagination. Now, distributed teams are part of the challenge. One of the things that I realized pretty early on in my architect career was we're spread pretty thin. I used to think that we didn't have great architects because I hardly ever talked to mine. And then as soon as I became an architect, I had like 40 projects dropped on my head the next morning. And geez, it's a lot for you to juggle. You got to prioritize all these things and try to figure out, which projects need me and which ones can I let kind of work on their own. And so there's a couple ways to think about this. I mean, one is cost, complexity, and risk. In other words, what's the impact of failure? Obviously, those projects that are more costly, where the impact of failure is a bigger deal, probably need more of your time and attention. It's also important to let your teams judge this a little bit too. You look at some teams, they're more mature, they might not need as much help. If you've got teams that are struggling, they might need a little more help, especially early on. It's also important to realize that some projects are doing more novel work. They might require a bit more handholding. And of course, any projects that are on the C suite's radar probably are ones that need to be higher up on our priority list. Now, if you're not sure what you should do, well, talk to your management, try to figure it out, help have them guide you on the prioritization. But no matter how you prioritize your projects, you realize pretty quickly that you can't be everywhere at once, which is why it's so vitally important that we establish principles. So, unless you've got one of those crazy time turner things, the reality is you're not going to be involved in every single decision. That's okay. We absolutely must empower our teams. We don't want to be the bottleneck. It's important for us to distribute decision making across our teams. Now, the scary part here is you've got to let them do their thing. And so, how do we make sure they're making good decisions? Well, we have to establish principles or guardrails or guideposts or North Stars, whatever you want to call them. What we're ultimately trying to do is create an environment within which our projects can thrive. Now, how do I know if people are actually doing what I'm asking them to do? Well, that's where this concept of fitness functions comes from. At some point in your educational career, someone taught you the second law of thermodynamics, which I refer to as the teenager's bedroom. The universe, for better or worse, wants to be disordered. Sadly, software is not immune from this. Every one of you at some point in your career has started on a new project and you're like, oh, thank God, this time we're going to do it right. And 6 months later, you're tearing out your hair going, why did we cross the streams? How did we end up in the same place we were before? Is this just the inevitable reality of software? As architects, we go through this effort to establish an architecture, and we don't spend enough time thinking about how to maintain it. And this is especially important because you can't spend every minute of every day with every single one of your projects. So, how do I make sure teams are making good decisions? Realizing, of course, that my ability to predict the future is not good. Now, the best we can do, frankly, is study history. There's no getting around that. That's an important part of this equation. Now, I will argue around the edges on this. We can't predict the future because there is one thing I feel pretty confident in, and that's change. Pretty comfortable saying that a few years from now, things are going to be different than they are today, which is a bit of a conundrum because we typically define architecture as the decisions that are hard to change, the decisions we wish we got right. But I know things are going to change. And isn't this ultimately anti agile? Which is why a lot of companies have said, well, we're agile, we don't have architects. Every time I hear this, and I've heard this a lot, I have to kind of bite my tongue because the reality is it doesn't matter what you've got for titles or roles. You've certainly got people making architectural decisions. I hope for your sake they're making good ones. Don't worry, you'll know in a year or two. I had a student a couple years ago who told me that her application had 4 different UI frameworks baked into it at this point in its career. And she said, yeah, we don't have any architects in my company. That's kind of why I'm here. I'm actually trying to learn how to be an architect and what that means. And but we don't have any architects. And I thought, yeah, well, that's part of the problem here. And you kind of need to have an adult in the room willing to stand up and say, hang on, guys, I don't think we need a third framework. And please, the fourth one is when someone should have flipped a table. So what do we do about that? Well, we could change our assumptions. It turns out Martin's a pretty smart guy. I think this is pretty good advice. Build for what's in front of you today. Choose technologies that can evolve one use case at a time. That makes sense. And so this is part of this theory now behind evolutionary architectures, which says let's design architectures that expect change. And this book has been pretty influential for me, and I'm sure for many others. And one of the bits I love in here is this evolutionary architecture supports guided incremental change. Guided incremental change. That's what we're shooting for here. Now, to be clear, some architectures are more evolvable than others. A lot of people have gone down the microservices path and went, oh my gosh, my call tree looks really bad. There's a reason these are called Death Star architectures, but maybe we can change our approach a little bit and we can deploy components and turn features on and off with toggles. We can change more incrementally. We can actually use hypothesis driven development. But that again puts us as architects in this conundrum of how do we know that this architecture, as it evolves, as it changes, is still meeting our needs? How do we know if some refactoring, some new feature hasn't violated some important part of our architecture? That's where the idea of fitness functions comes from. Now, this comes right out of evolutionary computing, which says fundamentally, is this mutation a success? Are we closer to or further from our goal? For us as architects, this is all about protecting the ilities and balancing these trade offs. And one of the things I love about thinking of through fitness functions, it gives you an opportunity to capture and preserve these key architectural characteristics that are important. Now, you can look at this ultimately as a set of tests that we execute to make sure that our architecture is still meeting our needs as the application evolves and grows and changes. So, as we refactor, as we add new pieces, are we closer to or further from our goals? Are we still aligned to our objectives? Now, in a perfect world, this is all automated, but there's still going to be some manual verifications. Sorry. I'll run you through some examples very quickly. It might decide performance matters, so all service calls must respond within an average of 100 milliseconds. You might want your code base to be relatively simple, so you want to keep your cyclomatic complexity below a low single digit number. You probably don't want to have cyclic dependencies. You might care about directionality of imports. Maybe you've got a fairly young staff and some of them haven't quite figured this out. And so, it's totally fine if persistence and web include util. But if we happen to go the other way and someone pulls web into util, we'd like to break the build on that. We can use consumer driven contracts as a way of maintaining the contract that we are giving to our consumers so that when we make changes, we don't deliberately break a consumer or unintentionally break a consumer. Spring Cloud Contract helps with a lot of this. There are actually testing tools now that we can apply to our architecture. There's ArcUnit. There's also a .NET variant of this. There's scientists from the GitHub folks. There's all sorts of interesting tools that are starting to appear in this space. We might look at average and maximum response times. We might look at scalability across number of users, number of requests. We might look at number of timeouts, number of application faults. I teach a graduate school class, and last semester, one of my students said, "Hey, I want to look at what happens when we get closer to the next pricing tier with our cloud provider." You might decide that if I have a hard failure of an application, a new instance will spin up. Now, the challenge in a lot of these situations is we want to alert when something goes out of band. We need to have some good monitoring in place. That's a topic for another day. We're probably going to need to introduce a certain amount of chaos into the system as well, because we're not going to think of everything. So we're going to need a little bit of this to help keep us on our toes. One of the things I absolutely love about fitness functions is they remind us of what's important in our architecture and they inform us about the trade offs that we're making. Now, obviously, you want to identify as many of these as early in the process as you can. The discussion around them is just invaluable to understanding the system and understanding what matters. They help you prioritize. They might change how you actually architect the system, how you break things up. Now, obviously, you're not going to know everything up front. An awful lot of things will emerge as the system grows and evolves. We want to do as good a job as we can of figuring this out as early as we can. This is a great thing to have visible as much as possible in the proverbial project room. You need to review them on a regular basis and ask yourself, is this still relevant? Are there new dimensions that we need to track? Are there better ways of us actually tracking and measuring these things? I would do that at least annually, if not, more frequently. It just sort of depends an awful lot on where you're at in your company, where you're at in the project's life cycle. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about how we deal with distributed expertise in these organizations. Nobody has a monopoly on the knowledge. And one of the challenges we face as we grow and expand and have people spread all over the place, how do you recognize it? How do you encourage it? One of the approaches that I've seen is a center of excellence or a community of practice. It's same basic concept, phrasing, however you want to call it's fine. This could be built around a fairly broad topic. It can also be more narrow. It just depends on what you're trying to do. There's no limit on how many of these you can have. In the ones that I've been a part of, they typically meet monthly. And ultimately, what they do is give you a forum where a group of interested people can come together and talk around what's happening in our organization about this thing, whether that's cloud computing or mobile development or JavaScript frameworks or whatever makes you happy. It's a fantastic venue to have 15, 20, 30-minute presentations, 45-minute presentations. I've seen everything from just a real quick 5-minute overview to, this is an entire meeting devoted to a presentation on this topic. I would strongly advise you to make sure that you have time for people to talk to one another, to give people a chance to bounce ideas off one another, get feedback, get advice, share lessons learned. This is where we start to build these relationships. When I first became an architect, one of the things that I was concerned about was there's so much breadth in our space. I can't possibly know the answer to everything. And one of my peers took me aside one day and said, Nate, you can't know everything. That's impossible. The key thing to being a good architect is knowing where to go to get your questions answered. And that's around building relationships. So who in this organization can help me with this? I was talking to a gentleman from another company, and he told me that in their organization they have a guild model where they essentially form groups around various topic areas, and it's the recognized experts within the organization about that topic. Now these are sort of organic, self-organizing kinds of things. It seemed to imply there's kind of a nomination phase, or else people are like tapping other people on the shoulder saying, hey, I'd like you to join our guild, I know you know a lot about this. Meet on whatever cadence works. Maybe that's every other week, maybe that's every other month. It just depends. Again, in the organizations I've talked to about this particular concept, there's usually some kind of an email list, Slack channel where they can talk to one another, get advice, feedback, etc. And then there's also usually kind of a guild specific discussion mechanism where the guild members can chat, plan, hey, we should put out a presentation on this thing. I'm getting a lot of questions about this. A lot of benefits that come out of this concept, again, regardless of whether you call it guild or a community practice or a center of excellence. When I was a part of these in my previous organization, this is where a lot of our best practices and standards would grow from. Our reference implementations would usually come out of these groups. This is where we did a lot of internal evangelism. So cloud architect was my last gig in my previous company, and that was a huge part of my job, was basically just doing these cloud 101, 201, 301 presentations, and a fair amount of internal consulting to help people adjust to this new reality. There also tends to be a fair amount of developer enablement like activities. Wow, we've got all these new tools and technologies and software and approaches. Somebody has to kind of wade through that and figure out what makes sense for us. It's a fantastic way of influencing the organization as well, by the way. Speaking of that, I'm a huge fan of the technology radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks a few times a year. I love it as one of the most powerful visuals we have, and it gives you a real, I think, a very easy way of seeing the trends in technology, what's coming, what's dying. Ultimately, where should we be investing our time and energy? And so I just pulled this out of one of the recent radars and kind of see where things are landing inside of these various rings. I'm a huge fan of these. Their basic concept here is hold, assess, trial, adopt on the way out, on the way in. And so a hold technology is something that's very early. It's either something that's very new or it's kind of on its way out. So don't start a new project there. Next level in, we're doing demos. We're kind of figuring out when it's suitable. Next level in, we're going to do some pilot projects. And then once we get to the adopt ring, you should be using this now. A former thought worker told me the whole goal of that ring is, if you're not using this at the pub, if you're not using this technology, I'm going to make fun of you at the pub tonight. Modify the language for your company. I actually built one of these at one of my previous organizations, and we actually changed the language to contain, assess, early adopter, generally available, because that just fit better with a lot of our roadmaps. The language is fungible. Quadrants, we're looking at techniques, tools, platforms, languages. Again, modify for your needs. I'm a huge fan of doing one of these for your company. I know this is something Neil has talked about for years. It's not that complicated. No, it's a very straightforward thing to do. I strongly recommend it. You just get the right people in the room with some sticky notes. You've probably got some existing documentation. It's probably not very good. Make a rough pass, circulate it, get some feedback, iterate. Once you feel pretty comfortable, start sharing it with people, and then eventually you can formalize it. You can actually get the radar code from ThoughtWorks if you actually want to use that. I know a couple organizations. In fact, I helped one organization with this a couple of years ago. They have their own internal radar that they use built off of the ThoughtWorks code base. What I love about it is it works up, down, and across. There's not a lot in our organization that works with business folks, IT folks, and at different levels. It's not just an artifact for developers or just an artifact for management. It works for pretty much everybody in the company, and that's a very powerful thing for us to have in the toolkit. I also recommend doing this for yourself, by the way. When you're trying to figure out, what stuff should I play with this year? Where do I want to spend my development time? Use this as a way of guiding you. And ultimately, what you're trying to do here is portfolio theory. If you think about the way most of us have our retirement investment invested, it's all about trying to get as much money as possible into something that's pretty solid in returns, nothing super extravagant, but it's going to be dependable. And then some amount of your money might be a little more high risk, high reward. It's the same with tech skills. There's certain tech skills that we all know are valuable, and some, yeah, this could be a flyer. Maybe I'll play with it. The other thing I'd like to say is a lot of companies do internal conferences. I've helped out with several of these over the last few years. I know a lot of organizations have their own internal events that can go from anything just from a few hours all the way to a few days. It just depends on how much you want to bite off. having organized a few of these for my previous company, a lot of effort goes into it, to say the least. So don't think this is going to happen in spare cycles. It's going to take some serious investment and time. I'm also a fan of this sort of architectural roundtable concept. Someone was telling me about the way they do it in their company, and basically what they do is have a group of people that gets together weekly. They sort of propose ideas over Slack. Hey, what do you guys want us to talk about? Are there any presentations you want us to do? And then they go ahead and share that out. So take advantage of that existing expertise. Don't be afraid to crowdsource. Use GitHub, pull requests, whatever works for you. The beauty of this is experiment, try it out, see what works. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop that and see if I have any questions hiding in the channel here. Brian, forgive me. I'm not sure where to look for questions.
Oh, that's no problem. I have you covered already.
Fantastic.
There are not many questions at this point.
All
I've
right.
got one question in. What is the best way for architects to keep in the know? I think this gentleman is not natively English, but
To stay current with technology,
yeah,
probably?
About the breed of distributed computing. It seems like drinking from a fire hose these days.
Well, I would say that's true of technology in general. Every time you turn around, there's
Absolutely.
new languages, new techniques, new technologies. This is something I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about. It's hard. You can't keep up with everything, and you have to sort of pick and choose the areas that are interesting to you. What are the things that you're passionate about? Because if you don't have passion for it, you're not going to take the time out of your day. You're going to find other things. I'll give you a perfect example for myself. I am not a database person. All right. I know just enough SQL that they don't let me write SQL. Okay. And most of my career has been front end work. I get the data to the server, and then I don't know, squirrels put it in trees or something happens. And there was one day I'm like, I should really learn more about these NoSQL databases. And I sat down with I think it was NoSQL Distilled or whatever. And I was going to okay, this is it. I've got a Saturday. I'm going to work on this. And I literally went and organized my sock drawer. All right. Because I'm like, I just wasn't passionate about it. And so you have to let your passion guide you and direct you. These are not full-time decisions. You can spend, for the next 2 months, I'm going to go deep dive on JavaScript frameworks. And then 2 months, I'm going to go deep dive on Kafka. And then 2 months, I'm going to go deep dive on something. And that's perfectly fine. These are not permanent decisions. Let your passion guide you. And remember, if something is a big enough deal, you're going to hear about it. It's going to bubble up. And again, I think the most important part of this for us as architects, for tech, whether you're an architect or a principal engineer or a senior engineer, it doesn't really matter. How do you keep up with the industry, and then having some kind of a network of people that you can reach out to ask about these more specific questions that you're inevitably gonna run into. You're never gonna know all the answers. Sorry.
I completely agree. Very good question. Great question, Karam. I've got one question for you. Like you started with remote working stuff at the beginning of your presentation. What do you think is the most difficult part of it? Because if I look at me personally, I work remotely, but I think time zones is the most difficult thing within remote working and remote distributed teams.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The time zone pieces is hard. I just had a meeting earlier this week with the person who proposed it. I can't remember what time she originally proposed it for, and then someone on the West Coast like, could we please avoid West Coast lunch? And it's like, well, we've got people in the West Coast, we've got people in Central, we've got people in Eastern. There's no way we're going to avoid everyone's lunch hour. And, part of that's flexibility of, okay, I might have to, quote unquote, meet over lunch or whatever, and being willing to spread the pain around. So the TAB, the Technology Advisory Board from ThoughtWorks, they're global. And so basically every third meeting or whatever it is going to be in a time zone that doesn't work for you, because you can't always have one group of people being the ones that have to get up at 2 a.m. So distribute the pain, understand that just part of the deal, and just do your best to be flexible with that, and understanding of other people that, yeah, I'm not on the same clock as you are, and we're
Yes.
not all on the same body clock. You might work best at 7 a.m. I might work best at 7 p.m, and that's cool.
Yeah. And we do have to understand that things like my end of day is not your end of day.
Right.
If we need to do it today, and
Right.
well, and if we get along, but that's getting used to things. I mean, if you work in the same geographically in the geographic area that you used to work, like in an office, it's kind of natural to work from, for instance, 9 to 5, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, you
And
fall into that because you're around them, everybody, and so you all kind of fall into that same sort of rhythm. You don't have that rhythm when you're at home. I would say the hardest thing about being at home is making sure you have that separation. And it's so easy to get pulled into something and look up and go, "Oh, it's 7 p.m. I should probably, go say hi to my family or whatever." It's very easy to get sucked into that, and so I think it's important to make sure you do have some divider lines there too.
I agree.